Hey guys, it's Kieran Medhead here coming at you with another Punisher comic book review, and I know it's been a while since I put one of these up, and like I said before, I am moving on to do something a little bit different. I'm covering the Punisher original graphic novel, Return to Big Nothing. Now, I'm sorry I cannot remember exactly who it was, but in the comments on the last Punisher video, he asked me to also talk about the summer special, and I did a little looking into that, and since that's like a 6-issue miniseries that they would come back every year and do one over the summer, I will cover that in its own video later on down the line. My plan is that once I finish the 3 main ongoings, before I move on to the third one, the volume 3 of the Punisher basically is what it's called, from 98, I will do a couple of the miniseries that came out during the Punisher's big heyday in the early 90s and the late 80s. I'll do some of that in between those two runs, and maybe I'll come back, leave some for later and come back later on. But we'll get to that one later on, I promise. But I figured just to keep this one nice and simple, I will cover just the original graphic novel. Now, Return to Big Nothing is pretty interesting for me because it's dated 1987, which means it's pretty early on in the character's solo run. So it would have been, I'm not sure exactly when in 87 this was published. I should have done that research before I started recording, but it would have been around the time the ongoing started to get picked up, and I was looking forward to this because it's the same team who did Circle of Blood back again. It's Stephen Grant and Mike Zeck writing and illustrating it, along with some. I'll talk about the inkers and the colorists in a bit. I was curious to see this creative team back again, and also in the story that they could finish together, because Circle of Blood, Zeck leaves, I believe, because it was 6 issues long, I think, and he leaves after issue 4, which was a little too bad. But it was cool seeing these two get to complete a storyline together, and I was just, since I liked Circle of Blood, I was curious to see what these guys would do. And another interesting thing about this is that, which you'll notice right from the cover, is that it's put out by the Marvel imprint Epic, which was, I did a little research on this imprint, and they were created in 83 or 82. It's one of those two. To be mainly a creator-owned line for Marvel creators, they could make their own stuff that they owned instead of just stuff that Marvel owned that they worked on. Only it wasn't selling well, so they started doing comics with Marvel characters in them as part of the imprint. The first of which being Frank Miller and Bill Sienkiewicz on Elektra Assassin, which I have a script for Screenplay Archaeology, an episode down the line, which adapts that comic. I know very little about it other than the fact that apparently Sienkiewicz just didn't follow the script and drew whatever he wanted, so it made no sense. And I know Deus Deacon has read that, and he's told me all about how much he hates that comic. So I don't know anything about that, but that sold well, and so they started doing more Marvel stuff. And eventually Epic just kind of dissolved in the 90s, and they came back early on in 2003 for a bit. But one of the interesting things they did was they actually were the ones who localized the original Akira manga in the 80s, and then they finished it in the 90s. I think that's really interesting. And it was also the Marvel imprint where the Clive Barker stuff was published, the old stuff, the Hellraiser and the Nightbreed comics and the Pinhead comic and Hellraiser versus Nightbreed and all that. And apparently I just learned tonight that there was a Weave World comic under the Epic imprint, and I'm like, I'd like to read that now. Maybe that works out some of the kinks I had with the original novel. But to get into Return to Big Nothing, it's a storyline where the basic outline of it is that Frank is tracking down this illegal arms deal that turns out it's connected to this guy called Gorman, who's in the Marines, and Frank knew him in Vietnam, and they had a bit, and they didn't get along very well. They hated each other. And now Frank is learning the full extent of what was going on with Gorman and his criminal enterprises. And it makes for a fairly interesting story. And before I go into details, I want to talk about the art. I think Zeck's art is great. I really liked his art on Circle of Blood. And because this isn't being published month to month, he had a lot more time to work on it. And so it's just really smooth and just technically proficient. And it looks really, really good. I love the art in this book. And Zeck did a pretty damn good job. And I love the way he draws the Punisher, because he draws him as being big without being unrealistically big looking. And I love the way he draws the face and just those cold blue eyes. He gives this real sense of just heartlessness and just complete anger, but then when there's moments where he lets his guard down and you see it, there is more going on behind those eyes. I love the way he draws it. And I love the way he draws the Punisher's hair, because it almost makes him look a little bit like Superman, which I find just incredibly amusing in a good way. And the inks by John Beatty are pretty strong. I can't say anything too bad about that. And Zeck was one of the colorists, along with Ian Tetral and Phil Zimmelman. Sorry if I mispronounced Ian's last name there, but they did the colors and they did a good job. They managed to have a pretty good looking color palette while still being dark, because there's a lot of blacks, a lot of whites, a lot of shadows. It's not moody and noir in the way that I found Klaus Jansson's art on the early ongoing to be. But it's a pretty solid color palette and pretty dark looking. There's some cool Punisher lurking in the shadows stuff. And just some cool sort of things that they do here and there. It's a good looking comic. So yeah, props to the colorists and props to the actual artists. Well, the colorists are actual artists, but you know what I mean. Mike Zeck on pencils and Beatty on the inks. And the story, just to get into the details of what this story is about, you know, it starts off with Frank. He's tracking down this arms shipment, and he's actually hidden himself inside one of the boxes. And it's actually kind of interesting that you get his internal monologue where he's saying, "They're laughing, but I'm in the box." And you don't really know what that means at first, because it's just a big black panel with a giant, because it's a full page spread of like Frank's face against a black background in the panel. So you don't really know what he's talking about at first. Then as you read it, you kind of get the idea, and that's interesting. And so so he hides in the box so he can get to the meeting, and it turns out that this is tied into these Cambodian gangsters. And it turns out that there's these 2 FBI agents who have infiltrated, but they get called out, and so a firefight starts, and so Frank has to pop out, take care of the problem. He ends up blowing up the weapons in the process, and Frank actually wanted to take the weapons as part of his operation, which is something that he'll do. He talks about in the ongoing. Unfortunately, he has to destroy them, and he says, "Hey, it's unfortunate, but it's something I gotta do." And one of the FBI agents dies, and the other one is wounded, and Frank's talking to the guy, and he talks about how, like, they were working for the FBI, but they're low-level guys, and they were having trouble advancing, and when they got wind of this arms deal, they figured if they went and took it down by themselves, you know, that would up their rep, essentially. And I thought this was an interesting idea. We have these 2 guys who are more on the side of the law than Frank is a lot of the time, but they're different. But they're also going against the system, and kind of like Frank does. I found them to be an interesting contrast. And Frank says, "Okay, I'm gonna go drive you to a hospital." But you go into his inner monologue, and it's very clear that Frank knows this guy's wounded too badly, and he won't be able to get him the help in time. But I like that he still helps him. Granted, it's for slightly self-serving motives, as we find out in a bit. But I think Frank, if he could have gotten him to a hospital, I think he would have. At least this version of Frank probably would have tried. And so he's driving, he's trying to get him to the hospital, and they talk about how, like, this is all tied into the mob and the military, and it's all being run by this guy called Gorman, and Frank remembers him from his Vietnam days. And there's an interesting point here where in the narration, because the FBI guy says, "You knew him," and then in the narration boxes it says Frank Castle knew him, and the idea he no longer truly thinks of himself as Frank Castle, at least not the same Frank Castle from before his family died. I think that's an interesting idea. And so we get a flashback where Frank, who's a new recruit just out of basic training, he's waiting for deployment at this camp, which is somewhere in the middle of the desert, and he doesn't remember what its real name was, but they nicknamed it Big Nothing. And he's running his mouth off saying about how this fight's going to be easy. The Viet Cong, they're not trained. As soon as the government starts treating this like a real war, we can just go in there and kick ass and save the day. And then Gorman, who's this hardened veteran who's been fighting in the jungle for a while, comes in, has words with him. And then Frank who's this young, impetuous version of himself, tries to pick a fight with him and then gets his ass handed to him. And then Gorman nicknames him Big Nothing in this scene. And so, okay, interesting conflict that started in the past, but you don't really quite know everything with Gorman yet. You're still wondering. And so in the present, the Fetty bleeds stuff where Frank can help him, but so he takes his case notes and his identification. And so now we go to Gorman. He has an associate named Snow, who I believe he's working with the mob. I was a little unsure of this, but he's in Vegas, so I guess he's the mob connection. But so they find out that the Punisher is after them, and Gorman, who's talking about retiring soon and getting out of the business, he looks into the Punisher to find a way of getting rid of him. And I like this part a lot because he looks at the file photo and he immediately recognizes Frank Castle. The reason I like this so much is because in the ongoing comic, Mike Baron just seems to be completely... He just loves to run with this idea that nobody seems to know who the Punisher is. And I don't know where that comes from, but in this, people know... the Punisher is a known quantity. Gorman has heard of him before. When he looks into the file, he recognizes Frank Castle, whereas nobody in the ongoing ever seems to recognize Frank Castle, in costume or out. I like that this actually took a more logical approach. And so we get another flashback, and so Gorman, Snow, and Frank, they're on patrol out in the jungle, and he sends Frank on point ahead. And so Frank comes back and the other men to patrol are dead. And they're like, hey, Frank, it's your fault, blah, blah, blah. And back in the present, Frank has put the pieces together and he realizes that it's not real clear what happened because they don't show it, but Gorman and Snow, they either killed these men or set them up to die so that they could carve the bodies open and then use them to smuggle drugs back to the US. And that's basically how this whole smuggling ring got started. And so Frank, he uses the FBI badge he took to bluff his way onto the base where Gorman is working as a supply sergeant, which is the perfect cover for smuggling weapons out. And he gets to him and he has a gun to his head, and then several of the Cambodian gang members show up and disarm Frank, and Gorman just beats the crap out of him, and then he has the Cambodians start beating the shit out of him. And I think Frank goes down a little bit too easy here, especially considering, of course, these came out later, but the Punisher annuals, they show his vast martial arts skills. And so this felt a little odd that Frank was getting just the shit kicked out of him so hard. Okay, so he gets knocked out. And so he gets driven out into the desert, and he's in the trunk of a car, and the Cambodians set to blow with some dynamite. But Frank manages to kick his way out of the trunk, into the back seat, and out of the car before it blows. The Cambodians just walk away, apparently, not realizing he didn't die. They just go, oh, hey, we're going to leave it here, which is a bit of a dumb villain moment, but it's not too big of a problem. And so Frank grabs a book of matches left by the baddies, and that points him to where they'll be next. Now, earlier when he was talking to the commanding officer on the base, it was mentioned that Gorman's enlistment was going to be up in 2 days, and so he's basically disappeared since Frank last saw him. And so Frank uses the matchbook to track down his associates. And it takes him basically to a brothel in the middle of nowhere, and the bad guys haven't shown up yet, so Frank buys the company of a prostitute to keep us covered and wait for the guys to show up. And here's where this gets really, really weird. Strange in a way I don't even want to think about. Like, it just gets creepy. So, okay, he's talking to the prostitute, and he's thinking Maria, who was his dead wife, in case you don't know, she smelled like lilacs, and all women smell like Maria to me. Okay, a little weird, but whatever. Then he tells her, turn off the lights. And then in his narration, he says, in the dark, all women feel like Maria too. And I'm like, dude, Frank, I don't need to be getting into your head on this level. Too much information, dude. That was just weird. And that's also a problem I have with this comic as a whole, is that sometimes Frank's narration boxes get a little overwrought, a little too overdramatic, a little melodramatic. It's very Frank Miller in that sense. Now, granted, it never turns into just completely incoherent nonsense like later Frank Miller comics do. But at the same time, it's not like it ruins the comic for me or anything. In fact, I quite like this comic. It just gets a little weird here and there. And okay, they do what they do, we don't see it. And because this is epic and it could be a little edgier, that's why I could be so frank about Frank, pardon the repetition, it could be quite so upfront about Frank sleeping with a prostitute, even though they don't show anything. It's because it was epic and it was a magazine and it wasn't beholden to the comics code. So they could be a little more upfront about that stuff, but they do what they do, and he's asleep and he's dreaming of his family and he's watching his kids sleep, and he goes back into bed with his wife and they're talking. The first thing I want to mention about this scene is it is kind of a nice moment seeing like a different Frank with his family, like kind of like a more outgoing kind of Frank, a happier version of him. And it reminds me of, if you've seen Jacob's Ladder, there's a scene in that where Tim Robbins is dreaming about and you're wondering if maybe this is really happening and the rest of the movie has been a dream, where he's seeing his family, he's back with his wife and his kids, and his one kid who's Macaulay Culkin is not dead anymore, he's alive again. And you wonder if maybe all this horrible stuff that's been going on is a dream, and then later on he wakes up back in the rest of the movie, so of course it was a dream. It reminds me of that a little bit. And it predates Jacob's Ladder, which is interesting. But the other thing I found interesting is that he's all happy talking about how much he loves his kids and how great they are. And then Maria says something to him where she says, man, this is great. Not like the way you were before, or something along those lines. And that got the gears turning in my head as to wondering what that could mean. Like, maybe this really is a dream. Maybe his life wasn't quite this great. Maybe it had a lot more problems. Maybe he had a lot more issues, and maybe things were a little bit rough I'm not necessarily implying that there was abuse, but it was not always easy. It was not always this nice. Like, it almost seems to be maybe this is a dream, not necessarily a memory. It's more of how he wants to remember his family than how they actually were. Like, he's not remembering their flaws. It's just one line of dialogue, but it definitely had me thinking about it. And I thought about that too while watching season 1 of the Netflix show, because his wife especially is almost always shown in like an angelic light in his dream sequences and that. And it does kind of make you wonder if maybe that's just the idealized version in his head. But no, that actually was pretty good. It was a pretty nice little scene, and I'm surprised I got as much out of it as I did there. It's like he gets awoken by gunshots, which is just the worst way to get awoken when you're dreaming about your family who was shot to death. But, the drunken, gang members, they arrive to collect their cut from the whorehouse's money. And one goes to break in the newest girl working there, and then two, they go into the office and they're talking to the madam, or whatever you want to call her, and one stands guard in the hallway, and then Frank, who somehow gets into his Punisher costume in record time, he stealthily sneaks down and, kills the guard outside, and then he stabs him, throws him into the office as, a intimidation tactic, and he kills the two in the office, and that scene is pretty cool. And he goes after the one upstairs, and this is a weird scene because he's not I guess it's because even though it's epic, they're not allowed to show sex, I guess. So he's sitting on top of her, riding her like a horse. I'm sure that's a real fetish, but it was just weird that they went to that. And Frank, drags the guy out of there. He's fighting him, and, he's beating him up, and eventually he gets, the location of Snow from him, at the specific casino in Vegas. And then the girl that he was with shoots him dead, and then Frank is kind of upset about it because he thinks because he's such a young kid, maybe he'll let him go. But then he decides, he can't really blame her for what she did because it's basically what he does, and he gives her some of the money that they were collecting so she can go start a new life. That was a little weird. That didn't feel particularly Punisher to me. Just be like, hey, I'm going to let this dipshit go. That doesn't feel like Frank to me. Maybe it's because I'm just too used to Garth Ennis Frank, but it just feels a little off. And also earlier, after he killed those two guys in the office, there's a bit where all the Johns freak out from the gunfire and just start leaving. And there's this weird narration box where Frank is just they're feeding crime. I should kill them all, but I won't. And I'm like, okay, dude. That's a little crazier than I'm used to the Punisher being, and here I am just talking about being used to Garth Ennis Punisher, and even Garth Ennis Punisher wouldn't kill Johns in a whorehouse just because they're there, just because their money might happen to go to organized crime. It's okay, I don't think the Punisher traces responsibility quite that way. That was a little much. And once again, another overdramatic kind of thing. I'm like, okay, Frank, settle down, you're being a little too psychotic. Okay, so after that, Frank, he heads to the Vegas casino that Snow runs, and there's this weird bit where somehow he knows that the roulette tables have a cheating device, and somehow, I'm not really sure how he does this, but he, coerces the dealer into, pushing the button that helps him cheat on the wheel, and somehow he knows this is how it works. And so that draws Snow out of his office, and interestingly enough, Gorman is up in the office watching over the security camera, sees Frank, and then books it out the back door. And so Snow comes down to get Frank, and then Frank starts chasing him out of the casino, fighting off the guards and stuff. And he goes to drive away. Snow goes to drive away in his car, and this is pretty cool because it turns out that before he went in there, Frank, he chained the axle of the car to something. I wasn't really clear on what, but then but made it so that the car couldn't get away, and Snow just gives up and gives him information because he just knows he's fucked. And so this leads Frank to San Joaquin prison, where Q Dop, who is Gorman's Cambodian associate, is imprisoned. And so he uses the FBI badge again to get in, which this is a little bullshit, but once again, not a huge problem. And he knocks out the guard who's escorting him and steals his uniform because, of course, it's going to fit massive Frank Castle. And so he goes looking for Q in the exercise yard, and he sees him, and this is where we get the last flashback. Is that so the whole flashbacks are set around this, they're guarding this specific city in Vietnam, and I'm pretty sure it's not Saigon because I think it's meant to be I think they say it's earlier in the war actually, but they say it's not, they call it something, I forget what it's called, but they're evacuating the city, and there's a helicopter, there's not enough room on the helicopter because Frank gives up his seat to lets all these other men get off. It says, hey, there's one more leaving. And so he goes over there. It turns out Gorman is piloting, and it's full of these Cambodian guys, including Q Dap. And so Gorman's just like, hey, fuck it, Frank, and shoots Frank in the shoulder and leaves him behind, and says that Frank did actually make it back to friendly territory, and he reported the incident, but it got lost in the bureaucracy and the paperwork, and the war just got worse after this point, so no one was really able to look into it. So Frank, he takes care of Q's bodyguards, and he gets the information from him, and he says that Gorman, he's operating out of the Big Nothing camp, which has been abandoned since the war. And he says that, he stuffed, the corpses with drugs in exchange for his family getting taken to America. And then there's a moment here where he repeats some overdramatic narration from earlier about packages, corpses, stuffed with China white, something along those lines. He repeats it word for word, and that's a little ridiculous. And then even though Q was begging, he did it for his family, he just snaps Q's neck and then escapes, because he apparently, this whole time, he's been counting down from a certain number, and that's because he somehow managed to set explosives on the wall without anyone noticing him, and that blows open the prison wall and he escapes. And I'm like, I'm not really sure how he did that. Maybe I missed it, but it's a little odd. And so he arrives at Big Nothing, and it seems like he jumps out of his, he says like, oh, there's a minefield here. And it looks like Frank in his uniform jumps out of the van, or whatever vehicle he's using, runs across the minefield, shooting the mines out of the ground. But then Gorman kills him with a rocket launcher, and it turns out that it was actually Snow in a spare Punisher uniform, which this allows. And I like that because there's a little bit of narration boxes where he's talking about how Snow is on his knees begging Frank not to do what he was going to do, and you think it's just about how he killed him outside that casino. No, he kept him around for later use, which I just think is fucked up but kind of cool at the same time. But this allows Frank to get around Gorman, and he shoots him in the shoulder and the kneecap. Then Gorman throws his gun away, saying that he's willing to do the time and get out and then start his business all over again. And this scene reminds me of the scene from Cobra, the ending of Cobra, where the Night Slasher is talking about how, like, the court is civilized, isn't it, pig? I'll get out. And he's like, because, like, this guy's like, I'll get out, I'll still be a rich man. He goes like, I'll have everything and you'll have, what have you ever had, Castle? And then in the narration boxes, because this is coming back from the beginning when he said Frank Castle knew him, he says, Castle? He's like, and he's going, Castle, and he just shoots him in the head, and he says, Castle is dead, I'm the Punisher. And I'm like, wow, that's cool. I'm like, they used that line for the 2004 movie. I'm like, that's just such a cool moment, showing just how detached he's become from the person he used to be. Like, he's just become consumed by the violence of it. That the Punisher isn't Frank Castle, or he's a different Frank Castle from the Frank Castle who had a family and was around before then. He shoots him dead, he drapes the Big Nothing banner over his corpse and then walks away. And there's some cool narration here at the end I might read off. He's talking about, where he says, he's talking about like people who laugh at the law and stuff like that, which is pretty cool. The rich ones who buy it and twist it to their whims, the other ones who have nothing to lose, who don't care about themselves or other people, all the ones who think they're above the law or outside it or beyond it. They know all the law is good for is to keep good people in line, and they all laugh. They laugh at the law, but they don't laugh at me. Oh, that is so cool. I love it. Yeah, that's a really good story. I like that it explored Frank and his attitude towards criminals and showing like his different sort of methods, like how he's able to like case a job and do a little bit of detective work and bluff his way. He's a very clever strategist, which I like. And I like how it ties it back to his military days. And I like how I get glimpses of his family too. It's like you're getting like sort of a microcosm of a lot of different things the Punisher was, specifically in the late 80s and early 90s. Like you get the action, you get the crime fighting, you get his connection to his family, and you get his connection to Vietnam, which is something that Garth Ennis would pick up and really run with later on in a very interesting way. And Jason Aaron as well. But yeah, Punisher Return to Big Nothing I thought was a great sort of re-team of, the dream team of Stephen Grant and Mike Zeck. And if you're a Punisher fan, I recommend looking this one up and checking it out. It's definitely worth your time. So yeah, Return to Big Nothing, definitely give this one a chance. I definitely recommend it. And in the next video, I will be moving on and continuing my look at the Punisher ongoing with the Jigsaw puzzle story and a few issues after that. So until that time, guys, bye.